This is an essay called Terrorism in Africa. In 1998, United States embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya were bombed by terrorist forces of Al-Qaeda. These attacks have put growing threat of terrorism on the map. Today, there are more terrorist organizations than ever with easy access to weapons of mass destruction. This is cause of weak financial states, the Middle East not being able to provide the resources they need to fend off terrorists. Some countries are trying to combat terrorism with counterterrorism units, but the Middle East and especially Africa have become a stronghold for these terror groups. For the past few years, Africa has become a recruiting ground for terrorist organizations such as Al Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram. Osama bin Laden made a strategic decision to use Africa as a launching pad for Al Qaeda's global network and appeal. Many members of terrorist organizations have their roots traced back to Africa. Terrorism has a major impact on African governments and civilians. Many people have been killed, injured, and kidnapped as a result of increased terrorist activity. There need there needs to be many improvements in order to combat the threat of terrorism. The question that people are asking, what is being done to prevent the spread of terrorism in Africa? However, there is one country that's trying to answer that important question, and that country is Kenya. Kenya has a reputation for being known as Africa's most successful states, but Kenya is still susceptible to terrorist attacks, which has been a major weakness for them for quite a while. An example would be just earlier this year in January, when five jihadi gunmen attacked the hotel, an office complex in Nairobi. The gunmen forced their way past security barrier at the 14 Riverside complex in mid-afternoon. They brought automatic weapons and grenades and raided the D2 hotel. One of the gunmen apparently blew himself while others scattered the building, began firing their weapons and throwing their grenades at innocent civilians. Office workers, hotel guests that were caught in the attack either fled the horrific scene that was taking place or tried to hide in remaining hiding spots that were available. One of the survivors who was hiding in one of the offices gave a statement saying they were literally haunting us, banging on doors and calling us to come out. The terrorists then made their way to a restaurant that was attached to a hotel. They were fired upon civilians that were sitting down trying to eat their afternoon lunch. Kenyan security eventually made their way to the hotel complex, where they exchanged gunfire with the gunmen and killed them. The attack saw hundreds of people, with over 20 people killed. The incident was labeled as a terrorist attack, and it received widespread national attention. This wasn't Nairobi's first time experiencing a terror attack unfold. In fact, it was all too familiar scene. Nairobi has been there before, when four masked gunmen attacked the Westgate shopping mall in September 2013. The gunmen at the Westgate attack wore civilian clothes and carried firearms, grenades with them. They barricaded themselves inside a supermarket, taking over 80 people hostage. The police attempted several rescue efforts, but several difficulties getting into the building because of explosions caused by grenades. The gunmen were taken out by the Kenyan army, and the hostages were rescued. Over 150 people were injured during the attack, and the death toll was around 70. The terror group responsible for the Westgate mall attack was Al-Shabaab, or a Somali group of jihadists that are linked to Al-Qaeda. The terror group has claimed responsibility for both attacks. Another terrorist attack has been happened in Kenya. It was in April 2015 when gunmen stormed the Garissa University College. More than 100 people were killed, along with many others being injured during the attack. The attackers took several students hostage, but only freeing Muslim students while Christian students were still being held hostage. Since the attack, the hundreds of students were still unaccounted for. The attackers responsible were once again believed to be from Al-Shabaab militant group. The motive for the attack was that al-Shabaab indicated that they were retaliating over non-Muslims occupying Muslim territory. Kenya's long main rival has been al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is a jihadist terror group that is based in East Africa. Al-Shabaab began its operation in 2012 when they pledged their allegiance to one of the largest terror organizations in the world, Al-Qaeda. In February of that year, some of the group's leaders started to have conflict with Al-Qaeda, eventually split from them. Since Al-Shabaab has been on their own main interest to force out the Somali government and the foreign militaries that are associated with Somalia. Group is seeking to control territory within Somalia or to establish their own state that is based on their rigid interpretation of Sharia law. Sharia law is a major part of the Islamic tradition that forms religious laws that the Islam must follow. It is derived from two Islamic texts, the Quran, the Hadith. Since the terrorist attacks, there has been many dismay amongst communities, and many civilians have blamed the Kenyan government that and took and looked up to them for answers as why the attacks happened and what actions will follow, how Kenya will deal with future potential attacks. Kenya's president, Uhuru Kenyatta, has been under pressure to upgrade their security and counterterrorism legislation. Al-Shabaab's terror campaign against civilians, government officials, and police security forces across Kenya has skyrocketed for several years. In response to growing extremist threat, especially from Al-Shabaab, Kenya has adopted a largely militaristic security-focused approach against terrorism. Kenya's main interests have been protecting their nation from terrorists by passing more legislation on preventing terrorism, as well as increasing their military presence, security operation. He has made a lot of improvements to tackle the issue of terrorism. In fact, after the Garissa University attack that left hundreds of people dead, Kenya began to crack down on the incident and began to seek out those who were responsible. In July of this year, Kenya made some serious headway into their anti-terrorism campaign. They were convicted three suspects who were charged in the attack. Each suspect was saved by lengthy prison sentence. Rashid Charles Ambaresso, who was the main suspect in the university attack, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Hassan Aden and Muhammad Abi were two other suspects in the attack, and each of them were handed down a 41-year prison sentence. Chief Magistrate Francis Ndai, who read the three suspects their sentences, said the prosecution was able to prove that attackers committed the terrorist attack did it under the orders of al-Shabaab terror. Kenya has also made alliances with other nations such as Somalia, the United States, and Cameroon to combat the threat of terrorism. After a terrorist attack in Cameroon coordinated by the Boko Haram, Kenya sent military officials to learn how Cameroon dealt with their experiences. Kenya teamed up with Somalia in February 2016 for a coordinated military strike against al-Shabaab militants. After the strike was completed, the Kenyan military announced that it had killed over 50 al-Shabaab members on a militant camp. According to the Kenya Defense Forces, al-Shabaab's chief of intelligence, Mohammed Karate, was killed along with 10 other high-ranking al-Shabaab commanders. However, al-Shabaab disputed the claim that Karate had been killed. Kenya also had a long historical relationship with the United States. This relationship goes back to the late 1990s during two embassy bombings in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. After the September 11 attacks, Kenya has become a major partner in the war on terror. Since then, the United States has pursued interest in Africa by supplying aid to nations in need. The United States have also provided funding, training, and military hardware to their allies in Africa. For Kenya, they are considered to be one of the most pro-American states. Kenya's interests, their alliance, United Nations security and stability. With the help of the United States, Kenya has been able to professionalize their military, increase scrutiny and awareness, and the ability to focus on counterterrorism strategies. Another interest is economic growth. Kenya has growing economy. It's become a major transportation hub for East Africa. Trade investments has helped their relationship. The Kenyan government has also stepped in on the issue when they asked the United States nations to list Al-Shabaab as a terrorist group. Kenya even called on the world to unite in the fight against global terrorism after Al-Shabaab killed 26 people when a suicide bomber rammed a vehicle loaded with explosives into the Medina Hotel. Among the dead were three Kenyan nationals and foreigners from Kenya, Canada, America, and Tanzania. Somali Journalists Association were also confirmed that two journalists were killed during the attack. Kenya's government has made serious efforts to counter radicalization and the rise in terrorism, but the biggest piece of anti-terrorism legislation passed in 2012. The legislation is called the 2012 Prevention of Terrorism Attack and expands the powers that the police can use and allows the state to create lists of suspected terrorist organizations without going through the due process. Kenya's government amended the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 2014 in order to aggressively investigate and prosecute terrorists. In 2014, Kenya passed the Security Laws Act, which changed several existing laws to strengthen Kenya's framework for creating anti-terrorism legislation. The new law created agencies to deal specifically with their fight against terrorism. These included the Anti-Terrorism Police Unit, a bomb disposal unit of cyber forensics investigative unit. The act also strengthened the Kenyan Defense Forces and Kenya's National Intelligence Services. The security laws have gave security agencies the constitutional and legislative authority to take counterterrorism measures and to safeguard national security. Kenya's main ports of entry also installed terrorist screening watch lists and biometric screening. While these legislative acts help greatly on cracking down terrorist organizations, many people have criticized the act for falling short on implementing ways to improve standards for justice for terrorist suspects. People have also stated that the act has given police too much power, which has resulted in human rights abuses, and critics of the Terrorism Act silenced by the Kenyan government. United States embassy bombings in 1998 put the growing threat of terrorism on the map. More terror groups are becoming stronger by the second as they take more control of territory, have easier access to weapons. Al Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram have emerged as some largest terrorist operations. Africa has become a hotbed for terrorist recruits, in which many of them are natives of Africa, are recruited by Al Qaeda or ISIS. Many African countries are affected by terrorism. The question is, what is being done to prevent the spread of terrorism? Kenya, who has been a victim of many terrorist attacks, tried to answer the question with legislation, military campaigns, alliances, investigative tactics. What is expected in the future is very difficult to predict, but if improvements in security, legislation, activism by the group government, there will be a decrease in terror activity. If the improvements are not made, then the continent will continue a long history of terror.